You think you know Atlantis, crystal-powered flying machines, laser death rays, an ancient race with technology beyond our own that vanished 12,000 years ago beneath the Atlantic waves, psychics channeling Atlantean souls, underwater roads in the Bahamas leading to sunken palaces. Every documentary, every book, every late-night YouTube video tells you this story. But here's what nobody mentions. Every single word of that narrative was invented by a 19th century Minnesota politician, popularized by a Kentucky psychic, and has exactly zero connection to what Plato actually wrote. The real Atlantis story is stranger, shorter, and far more calculated than anything you've been sold. What we got wrong isn't just the details. We got wrong what Atlantis even is. And understanding that changes everything. 360 before Common Era, Athens. A philosopher named Plato sits down to write two dialogues called Timaeus and Critias. He's 67 years old. He's already written Republic, his blueprint for an ideal state. Now he wants to show that ideal state in action, fighting a war. He needs an enemy, so he invents one. Atlantis, that's it. That's the whole lineage. Before Plato, nobody had ever heard of Atlantis. Not Homer, not Herodotus. Not a single Greek historian or poet mentions it. After Plato, his own student Aristotle dismisses it as fiction. Aristotle, who studied under Plato for 20 years, says his teacher made it up to illustrate a philosophical point. Plato himself structures the story as a tale within a tale within a tale. An Egyptian priest allegedly told it to Solon. Solon told it to Dropides. Dropides told it to Critias the elder. Critias the elder told it to Critias the younger. And Critias the younger is now telling it to Socrates. This is not how you present verified history. This is how you signal fiction. Renaissance writers understood this. Francis Bacon used Atlantis as a framing device for his utopian New Atlantis in 1626. Thomas More did the same with Utopia. They recognized Plato's literary technique. Then, in 1882, everything broke. Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, a failed politician from Minnesota, published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. The book claimed 13 propositions as fact. That Atlantis existed in the Atlantic Ocean opposite the Pillars of Hercules. That Plato's description was history, not fable. That Atlantis was where humans first rose from barbarism to civilization. That all ancient civilizations descended from Atlantis. That the gods of mythology were Atlantean kings and queens. That the Bronze Age tools of Europe came from Atlantis. That Atlantis was destroyed in a great flood. Donnelly spent years assembling his argument. He displayed massive knowledge of Plato, the Bible, archaeological discoveries, flood myths, and geological data. He overwhelmed readers with facts. He staggered them with brilliant arguments. But most of what Donnelly said was highly questionable or downright wrong. He proposed hyperdiffusionism, the idea that similar cultural elements in distant civilizations proved a common origin. He ignored that humans independently invent similar solutions to similar problems. He cherry-picked evidence. He mistook coincidence for causation. He treated mythology as distorted history. Gordon Stein, a historian of pseudoscience, described Donnelly as a crank and pseudoscience promoter. The publication date matters. 1882 sat in the middle of an international economic depression. Just 1 year earlier, Tsar Alexander II and President Garfield had both been assassinated. Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859, had sparked both interest in human evolution and the growth of scientific racism. An idealized vision of a peaceful, technologically advanced utopia that existed before recorded history appealed to people desperate for meaning and order. Donnelly's book sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It influenced generations of scientists who later did serious work in their fields. It spawned countless imitators. It birthed the modern Atlantis myth, and it bears almost no resemblance to what Plato wrote. If you value documented history and primary sources like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Project Gutenberg's complete translations of Plato's Timaeus and Critias, published and verified by classical scholars Benjamin Jowett at Oxford and the Internet Classics Archive at MIT, as well as peer-reviewed. Scholarship from Julia Annis at the University of Arizona, Christopher Gill's definitive work on Plato's Atlantis narrative in philosophy and literature in 1979, and Pierre Vidal-Naquet's scholarly study The Atlantis Story, published by the University of Exeter Press in 2007. Now back to the information. 9,000 years before Solon visited Egypt around 590. Before Common Era, a war occurred. Athens led one side, Atlantis led the other. Atlantis was an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, larger than Libya and Asia combined. The Atlanteans conquered parts of Libya as far as Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. Athens, standing alone after its allies abandoned it, defeated the Atlantean Empire. Then violent earthquakes and floods struck. In a single day and night, Athens' warriors sank into the earth. The island of Atlantis disappeared into the sea. The sea became unnavigable, blocked by shoals of mud. That's the war story. Plato gives more details about Atlantis itself in Critias. Poseidon received Atlantis as his portion when the gods divided the earth. He fell in love with Cleito, a mortal woman. He had 5 pairs of twin sons with her. He named the eldest Atlas and divided the island into 10 portions, one for each son. The capital sat on a hill. Poseidon created concentric rings of land and water around it. 2 rings of land, 3 rings of water. The rings connected by bridges. The outer ring was 3 stades wide. The channel from the sea to the outer ring was 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 50 stades long. Inside, the ring sat temples, palaces, and gardens. A temple to Poseidon stood at the center, 600 feet long, 300 feet wide, roofed with silver, pinnacled with gold. Inside was a statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses, tall enough to touch the ceiling. The island was rich in minerals, including a mysterious metal called orichalcum that sparkled with red light. It had hot and cold springs. It supported elephants. The Atlanteans built a great plain behind the city, measuring 3,000 by 2,000 stades. They dug a canal around the plain and smaller channels crossing it. They bred horses. They mined metals. They became wealthy and powerful. For many generations, they followed divine laws. But eventually human nature prevailed. They grew greedy and corrupt. Zeus called the gods together to punish them, and the dialogue ends, unfinished. Critias breaks off mid-sentence. No description of the destruction, no flood, no details of the final punishment. The dialogue simply stops. Plato never mentioned psychic powers. It existed 50,000 years ago or longer. Plato said 9,000 years before Solon, which calculates to roughly 9,600 before Common Era. It sank 12,000 years ago in a global cataclysm. Plato said earthquakes and floods destroyed it in one day and night, around 9,600 before Common Era, if you take his chronology literally. Modern Atlantis influenced Egypt, the Americas, Ireland, and Asia. Plato said Athens defeated Atlantis, and then both civilizations were destroyed. He never mentioned Atlantis founding other civilizations. Modern Atlantis sits in the Caribbean, or off Spain, or in Antarctica, or beneath the North Sea. Plato specifically said beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean. Every one of these editions appeared after Donnelly. None came from Plato. Between 1923 and 1945, Casey gave over 14,000 recorded readings. 700 of them mentioned Atlantis. Casey's Atlantis bore no resemblance to Plato's. He described a civilization spanning from 53,000 before Common Era to 10,000 before Common Era. He said Atlanteans possessed advanced technology, including flying vehicles that could travel through air, water, and space. They used crystals to harness solar energy. They operated elevators and tunnels with compressed air and steam. They mastered silicon chip technology beyond modern levels. They performed psychic feats, including telepathy and astral projection. They could extend their lives for hundreds of years through rejuvenation chambers. Casey described 3 periods of destruction. The first 2 occurred around 15,600 before Common Era, when the mainland divided into islands. He named 3 main islands, Poseida, Og, and Arion. The final destruction happened when the Atlanteans misused their crystal technology, particularly a giant crystal called the Great Crystal, or the Tuaoi Stone, or the Firestone. This crystal, he said, could amplify energy, power vehicles, transmit images and sound, and even generate gravity waves. According to Casey, the sons of Belial, a corrupt faction, fought against the children of the Law of One, a spiritual faction. The sons of Belial's greed and misuse of the crystals triggered earthquakes that sank what remained of Atlantis around 10,000 before Common Era. Casey made specific predictions. He said remnants of Atlantis would rise near Bimini in the Bahamas between 1968 and 1960. 9. He said records from Atlantis were hidden in 3 locations: near Bimini in the Yucatan and beneath the Sphinx in Egypt. He said these records would be discovered and would include the history of Atlantis, instructions for the crystal technology, and proof of the continent's existence. He said many Atlantean souls were reincarnating in America to usher in a new age of consciousness. He predicted that Los Angeles and San Francisco would be destroyed before New York. He predicted the second coming of Christ in 1998. None of these predictions came true. The formation consisted of limestone blocks arranged in a linear pattern roughly 1,500 feet long, running parallel to 2 shorter formations before curving into a hook. The blocks measured up to 13 feet in length, appeared rectangular, and sat 20 feet beneath the surface. Casey's followers immediately declared it the confirmation of his prophecy. finally, proof of Atlantis. Except it wasn't. In 1978, the University of Miami Department of Geology drilled core samples from the Bimini Road. Radiocarbon dating of whole rock samples, shells extracted from the cores, and carbonate cement produced dates between 2,770 and 3,510 years before present. The formation was roughly 2,000 to 3,500 years old, not 12,000 years old. Not even close to the Atlantis time frame from either Plato or Casey. The rocks were identified as beach rock, a naturally occurring limestone that forms rapidly beneath beach sand through cementation of sand, shells, and sediment. Beach rock forms in the intertidal zone when fresh water mixes with seawater, precipitating calcium carbonate that cements the sediments together. As sea levels rise or beaches erode, beach rock becomes submerged. Natural joints, fractures in the rock that form perpendicular to each other, create the rectangular block patterns. Tidal action and erosion along these joints give beach rock formations the appearance of cut stone. Geologist Eugene Shin from the United States Geological Survey studied the site. Marshall McCusick from the University of Iowa studied it. John Gifford from the University of Miami wrote his master's thesis on it. Eric Devad and A. Strasser from the University of Geneva studied it. Every geologist who examined the Bimini Road concluded it was natural beach rock, broken by orthogonal joints into blocks. Identical formations exist elsewhere. The tessellated pavement at Eaglehawk Neck in Tasmania. The tessellated pavement on the Booty Peninsula near Sydney, Australia. Natural beach rock pavements eroding from Loggerhead Key in the Dry Tortugas. Submerged beach rock beneath 300 feet of water at Pulley Ridge off southwestern Florida. The process that created these formations is well understood and well documented. When Shin visited the Bimini site in the mid-1970s, he found naked New Age believers swimming around the rocks, claiming they could feel energy fields emanating from the stones. One asked him, "Can't you feel the force field? It's strong here." Shin drilled cores, analyzed the structure, and published his findings. No tool marks on the stones, no evidence the blocks were ever stacked or moved, no sign of quarrying, no artifacts, no mortar, no harbor features, just limestone, cemented sand, and natural fractures. The Bimini Road is not Atlantis. It is not ancient. It is not artificial. It is beach rock. Some researchers argue that Plato based Atlantis on real events just with the wrong date. They point to the Minoan eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 before Common Era. The eruption was catastrophic. It ejected approximately 28 to 41 cubic kilometers of rock. It generated tsunamis that struck Crete. It buried the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri under volcanic ash, preserving it like Pompeii. The theory proposes that Plato or his Egyptian sources confused the date, and Atlantis was actually Minoan Crete, or Thera. Archaeological evidence supports an advanced Bronze Age civilization on Thera. Akrotiri had multi-story buildings with sophisticated drainage systems, colorful frescoes depicting ships and ceremonies, large storage jars suggesting trade, and organized streets. The Minoans on Crete built palatial complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. They created linear A script, which remains undeciphered. They traded extensively throughout the eastern Mediterranean. They influenced Mycenaean Greece. The eruption devastated this civilization. But here's the problem. Plato's account doesn't match. He described Atlantis as beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Thera and Crete are in the Aegean, inside the Mediterranean, not beyond Gibraltar. He said Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Crete is 244 kilometers long and ranges from 12 to 57 kilometers wide. Thera, before the eruption, was roughly 16 kilometers in diameter. Neither matches Plato's scale. He said Atlantis attacked Athens and controlled territory in Libya and Europe. There's no evidence of Minoan military campaigns against mainland Greece or control of North African territory. He described concentric rings of land and water. Neither Crete nor Thera has this topography. He said the destruction happened 9,000 years before Solon. The Theran eruption occurred roughly 1,100 years before Solon, around 1600 before Common Era. The dates don't match, even if you argue the Egyptians or Plato made an error. He described specific metals, elephants, and a plane measuring 3,000 by 2,000 stades. These details don't match Crete or Thera. Plato names Athenian kings in the story: Cecrops, Erechtheus, Erichthonius, Erysichthon. The Parian marble, carved around 264 before Common Era, dates these kings to approximately 1581 to 1250s. 1 before Common Era. If the Atlantis story references these kings, it cannot be set in 9600 before Common Era. The internal chronology collapses. Some argue that 9,000 was a mistranslation or exaggeration, that it should be 900, which would place Atlantis around 1500 before Common Era, matching the Bronze Age. But Plato uses the 9,000 figure consistently across multiple passages in both Timaeus and Critias. He also says Egyptian civilization began 8,000 years before Solon. He says Athens was founded 9,000 years before Solon. Reducing one number requires reducing all of them, which undermines the entire chronological framework Plato constructed. The Bronze Age theory is possible inspiration, not identification. Plato may have heard stories about the Theran eruption. He may have incorporated elements of Minoan civilization into his narrative. But Atlantis as written is not Thera. Plato was writing philosophy, not cryptography. For he is clearly using what has become a standard device of fiction, stressing the historicity of an event and the discovery of hitherto unknown authorities as an indication that what follows is fiction. The idea is that we should use the story to examine our ideas of government and power. We have missed the point if instead of thinking about these issues, we go off exploring the seabed. Christopher Gill, who wrote the definitive analysis, Plato's Atlantis Story and the Birth of Fiction, published in Philosophy and Literature in 1979, argues that Atlantis is the earliest example of conscious fiction in Western literature. Plato was inventing a genre. He was demonstrating how to construct a plausible but imaginary world to explore philosophical ideas. Renaissance writers recognized this. They used Atlantis, as Plato did, as a thought experiment. The shift happened in the 19th century when amateur scholars, lacking training in classical philology and philosophy, began treating ancient texts as encoded history. Donnelly epitomized this approach. He assumed Plato recorded genuine tradition, distorted by time but fundamentally true. He assumed myths from different cultures, pointing to flood events, proved a single historical catastrophe. He assumed architectural similarities between Egypt and Mesoamerica, proved contact rather than independent invention. He was wrong on all counts. Modern archaeology, linguistics, genetics, and geology have demolished the hyperdiffusionist model. We can trace the independent development of agriculture, writing, metallurgy, and urban civilization in multiple regions. We can date artifacts precisely using radiocarbon, dendrochronology, and other techniques. We can sequence DNA to track human migrations. We can analyze ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers to reconstruct ancient climates and catastrophes. No evidence supports a lost continent in the Atlantic. The mid-Atlantic ridge, where the tectonic plates of the Americas and Eurasia-Africa diverge, is spreading, not sinking. Ocean floor sediment cores show no sign of a sunken landmass. Sonar mapping of the Atlantic seafloor reveals underwater mountains, plains and trenches formed by plate tectonics, not the remains of a continent. Sea level records show no sudden flooding event around 10,000 before Common Era that matches Casey's timeline. The Younger Dryas period ended around 9600 before Common Era, with gradual warming and sea level rise over centuries, not a single catastrophic day. Studies on Atlantic Ocean floor geology published in 2023, radiocarbon dating protocols from the University of Miami Department of Geology, as detailed by Eugene Shin in 1978 and 1980, Kenneth Feder's Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, published by Oxford University Press in 2023, establishing the academic consensus on pseudo-archaeology, and Robert Todd Carroll's The Skeptics. Dictionary published in 2003 documenting the failures of Edgar Cayce's specific predictions. Now back to the information. The idea that an ancient civilization possessed secrets we've forgotten flatters our sense that we're rediscovering rather than discovering. It suggests that progress isn't linear, that we're climbing back to a peak rather than ascending for the first time. Second, the rejection of academic authority. Atlantis believers often frame themselves as truth seekers fighting against a closed-minded establishment. They argue that archaeologists dismiss evidence out of prejudice, that geologists ignore inconvenient data, that historians protect a false narrative. This framework allows them to maintain belief despite contrary evidence. Any scientist who debunks Atlantis becomes proof of the conspiracy. Third, the influence of popular media. Films, television shows, novels, and video games have embedded crystal-powered, technologically supreme Atlantis into popular culture. Disney's Atlantis, The Lost Empire in 2001, Stargate Atlantis from 2004 to 2009, Aquaman in 2018, the Marvel Cinematic Universe's references to Atlantis. These depictions shape public perception far more powerfully than academic papers. Fourth, the mixing of concepts. People conflate Atlantis with Lemuria, Mu, Shambhala, and other mythical lands. They blend Casey's readings with Donnelly's hyperdiffusionism, with theosophical ideas about root races, with Graham Hancock's theories about ancient catastrophes. The result is a syncretic mythology that draws from multiple sources and resists correction because there's no single coherent claim to refute. Fifth, confirmation bias and pattern recognition. Humans excel at seeing patterns, even when none exist. A limestone formation that happens to look rectangular becomes proof of construction. A flood myth in one culture that resembles a flood myth in another culture becomes proof of a single historical event. A similarity in pyramid construction between Egypt and Mesoamerica becomes proof of shared origin rather than convergent solutions to the problem of building tall stone structures. Sixth, the emotional satisfaction of belief. Accepting that Atlantis was fiction written by a philosopher to make a point about politics is boring compared to believing that psychics can channel Atlantean souls, or that underwater explorers are on the verge of discovering crystal power plants. The romantic vision is more exciting than the mundane reality. And finally, the misunderstanding of what Plato was doing. Modern readers approach ancient texts expecting either literal history or obvious allegory. Plato wrote something in between, a thought experiment disguised as history to make it feel concrete and real. This was a sophisticated rhetorical technique. By making his ideal Athens and cautionary Atlantis feel historical, he grounded abstract political philosophy in narrative. By setting them in the distant past, he avoided direct criticism of contemporary Athens. By leaving Critias unfinished, he kept focus on the ideas rather than the story's resolution. We miss all this when we ask, was Atlantis real? We know he presented it as a story told through multiple narrators, each claiming to have heard it from someone else, a structure that signals fiction in ancient literature. We know his student Aristotle, who studied under him for 20 years and had access to his teachings, stated that Plato invented Atlantis to serve his argument. We know no other ancient Greek or Roman historian, geographer, or philosopher before Plato mentioned Atlantis. We know that after Plato, only a handful of ancient writers mentioned Atlantis, usually in the context of discussing Plato's dialogues, not as independent historical tradition. We know the Timaeus and Critias contained philosophical arguments about ideal government, the nature of the cosmos, divine justice, and human corruption. Atlantis serves these arguments by providing a contrast to the idealized Athens. We know that Renaissance scholars understood Atlantis as a literary device, not a historical place. We know the modern Atlantis myth originated with Ignatius Donnelly's 1882 book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. We know Donnelly's main propositions have been refuted by modern archaeology, geology, and anthropology. We know Edgar Cayce popularized a version of Atlantis with psychic powers, crystal technology, and specific prophecies. We know none of Cayce's predictions about Atlantis came true. We know the Bimini Road, cited as evidence by Cayce's followers, is natural beach rock dated to 2,000 to 3,500 years before present. We know identical beach rock formations exist in Australia, Florida, and other locations. We know no geological evidence supports a sunken continent in the Atlantic. We know plate tectonics explains the current Atlantic Ocean floor structure without requiring a vanished landmass. We know the Minoan civilization on Crete and Thera experienced a catastrophic volcanic eruption around 1600 before Common Era. We know Plato may have heard stories about this eruption or other Bronze Age events. We know the details of Plato's Atlantis do not match the geography, scale, or chronology of the Minoan civilization. We know Plato described specific Athenian kings who lived in the Bronze Age, creating an internal chronology problem with his 9,000-year dating. We know that archaeologists, geologists, oceanographers, and historians who have investigated Atlantis claims, using scientific methods, have found no evidence for a historical Atlantis matching either Plato's description or modern mythology. What we don't know is whether Plato drew inspiration from any specific historical events or places. That question remains open. What is not open is whether Atlantis existed as described in modern mythology. It did not. What is not open is whether psychic Edgar Cayce accurately described a real ancient civilization. He did not. What is not open is whether the Bimini Road is an artificial structure. It is not. Here's what this means for how we think about ancient history. The Atlantis myth reveals how easily narratives detach from sources and take on lives of their own. Plato wrote 2 dialogues containing approximately 25,000 words about Atlantis. Over 2,000 years of scholarship understood these dialogues as philosophical works using a fictional setting. Then in 1882, one book reframed them as distorted historical memory. Within decades, that reframing became the dominant popular understanding. By the mid-20th century, Cayce's psychic elaborations had been layered on top of Donnelly's hyperdiffusionism. By the late 20th century, the modern myth was so entrenched that millions of people had no idea Plato's original account existed. They thought Atlantis meant crystals, flying machines, and lost continents from 50,000 years ago. This process, where later accretions bury the original material, happens constantly in popular understanding of history. Consider the Vikings. The popular image includes horned helmets, which Vikings never wore. The horns were added by costume designers for an 1876 Wagner opera. Now they're ubiquitous. Consider Cleopatra. She's remembered primarily for her beauty and romances, but she was actually a skilled politician and administrator who spoke 9 languages and negotiated with Rome as an equal for decades. Her political acumen gets erased in favor of simplified romantic narratives. Consider medieval warfare. Popular culture depicts knights in full-plate armor fighting with heavy swords. But plate armor didn't exist until the late medieval period, and swords were nimble weapons requiring significant skill, not the clumsy bashing tools shown in films. The pattern repeats. Someone writes something for a specific purpose in a specific context. Later readers, lacking that context, reinterpret the material. Still later readers, relying on the reinterpretation rather than the original, add new layers. Eventually, the popular understanding bears no resemblance to the source. Atlantis is the perfect case study. Plato writes a philosophical dialogue using a fictional civilization to explore ideas about government and human nature. Donnelly reads the dialogue 2,000 years later and treats it as garbled history. Casey channels supposed Atlantean memories and adds psychic abilities and crystal technology. Hollywood and popular media cement the modern myth. Now when someone says Atlantis, they mean the myth, not the source. When virtually every classicist, archaeologist, and geologist who has studied a topic reaches the same conclusion, their expertise matters. They might be wrong. Scientific consensus can change with new evidence, but the burden of proof lies with those claiming the consensus is wrong. Be skeptical of extraordinary claims. A lost continent with technology beyond our own requires extraordinary evidence. Beach rock formations, flood myths, and similarities in pyramid construction do not constitute extraordinary evidence. They have mundane explanations that don't require rewriting history. Understand the difference between inspiration and identification. Plato may have been inspired by Bronze Age stories, Minoan civilization, or other historical elements. That doesn't mean Atlantis is Thera or Crete. Artists draw inspiration from multiple sources and create something new. Recognize the appeal of mystery without surrendering to it. The unknown is exciting. The idea of lost civilizations and hidden knowledge captivates us, but excitement doesn't make claims true. We can appreciate the emotional power of the Atlantis myth while acknowledging that it's myth, not history. Ask what's at stake. Why do people want Atlantis to be real? Often it's about challenging perceived authority, finding meaning in ancient wisdom, or believing that humanity has forgotten important knowledge. These are understandable desires, but projecting them onto a specific historical claim about a lost continent distorts both history and the search for meaning. Donnelly's original thesis proposed that Atlanteans were the ancestors of civilizations in both the Old World and the New World. But he also suggested that Ireland was the home of an Aryan race of red-haired, blue-eyed descendants of Atlantis. This idea fed into racial theories popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Helena Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, incorporated Atlantis into her theory of root races. She claimed humanity had evolved through 7 root races, with the Atlanteans being the 4th. Her writings influenced Nazi occultism and other racist ideologies. The Nazis sent expeditions seeking proof of Aryan origins in superior ancient civilizations. Graham Hancock's recent work, while less explicitly racist, still promotes the idea of a lost, advanced civilization that influenced all others. This hyperdiffusionist model implicitly suggests that ancient non-European civilizations couldn't have developed independently, that they required outside influence from a superior culture. Archaeologists and anthropologists have spent decades fighting this narrative because it denies the achievements of indigenous peoples and ancient civilizations. When someone claims that Egyptians couldn't have built the pyramids without Atlantean or alien help, they're denying Egyptian ingenuity. When someone claims that Mesoamerican pyramids prove Atlantean contact, they're denying Olmec, Maya, and Aztec innovation. When someone claims that Pacific Islander navigation proves Lemurian influence, they're denying Polynesian skill. The pattern is consistent. The Atlantis myth and related lost civilization theories diminish non-European achievements by attributing them to vanished white advanced cultures. This matters. It shapes how people view history, how they understand human capability, and how they think about different cultures. The antidote is evidence-based history. We can trace Egyptian pyramid development from mastabas through step pyramids to true pyramids over centuries. We have the quarries, the ramps, the tools, the worker villages, the administrative papyri. We know how they did it. We can trace Mesoamerican pyramid development from early platforms through stepped pyramids to the massive structures at Teotihuacan and Tikal. We have the construction sequences, the dedicatory caches, the astronomical alignments. We know how they did it. We can trace Polynesian expansion across the Pacific through linguistic evidence, genetic studies, archaeological sites, and reconstructed navigation techniques. We know how they did it. No lost continent required. No vanished super race needed. Just human ingenuity, persistence, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Timaeus and Critias sit in a sequence of dialogues. Republic outlines an ideal state. Timaeus was supposed to describe the cosmos and the creation of humans. Critias was supposed to show that ideal state in action. Hermocrates, the fourth dialogue, was never written. The entire project remained unfinished. Plato was staging an intellectual performance. The characters in the dialogue aren't passive recipients of information. They're active participants in a philosophical discussion. Critias doesn't just recount the Atlantis story, he frames it as his contribution to the conversation, his way of bringing Socrates' ideal state into narrative form. The dialogue contains its own commentary. When Critias describes Atlantis' wealth, power, and corruption, he's demonstrating how even the best civilization can fall if it abandons virtue. When he describes Athens' lone stand against overwhelming odds, he's illustrating how moral excellence can overcome material power. The unfinished ending is itself significant. Plato wrote the entire setup, the ideal Athens, the powerful Atlantis, the coming conflict, and then stopped. He gave us the comparison, the moral framework, the philosophical problem. He left the resolution implicit. Zeus calls the gods together. We know what happens next. Atlantis is destroyed. Justice prevails. But Plato doesn't narrate it. He lets the reader complete the thought. This is sophisticated storytelling. Plato is not recording ancient tradition. He was crafting an argument about power, virtue, and divine justice using fictional history as his medium. Every classical scholar for 2,000 years understood this. Only when 19th century readers lacking training in classical literature encountered the text did it get reinterpreted as encoded history. We got wrong that it sank 12,000 years ago. Plato said 9,000 years before Solon, around 9600 before Common Era, but the internal chronology contradicts this, pointing instead to the Bronze Age around 1500 before Common Era as the implicit time frame. We got wrong that Atlantis influenced other civilizations. Plato said it tried to conquer them and was defeated. We got wrong that crystals powered it. Plato never mentioned crystals. We got wrong that psychics can channel Atlantean knowledge. Edgar Cayce's specific predictions all failed. We got wrong that the Bimini Road is evidence. Its natural beach rock dated to 2,000 to 3,500 years before present. We got wrong that underwater formations in the Bahamas, Mediterranean, or anywhere else are Atlantean ruins. They're geological features with mundane explanations. We got wrong that mainstream archaeology ignores evidence. Archaeologists have investigated every claimed Atlantis site and found no supporting evidence. We got wrong that ancient flood myths prove a global catastrophe. Flood myths are common because floods are common and catastrophic, and storytelling preserves memory of local disasters. We got wrong that similarities between distant civilizations prove contact. Humans independently invent similar solutions and similar myths. We got wrong that conventional dating methods are unreliable. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and other techniques have been extensively validated and cross-checked. We got wrong what Plato was trying to do. He was writing philosophy, not encoding secret history. We got wrong how to read ancient texts. We imposed modern expectations of history and science onto a text written with different purposes and conventions. We got wrong what it means for Atlantis to be fiction. Fiction doesn't mean unimportant. Plato's Atlantis has value as philosophy, literature, and cultural inheritance. It doesn't need to be historical to matter. A 4th century before Common Era philosopher invented a detailed fictional civilization to explore ideas about power, morality, and political systems. His invention became one of the most enduring myths in Western culture. For 2 millennia, readers understood it as myth. Then one man, driven by personal conviction and pseudo-scientific methods, reframed it as history. Within a century, the reframing had eclipsed the original. Another man, channeling supposed psychic knowledge, added layers of science fiction. Within decades, those additions became inseparable from the myth. Now the myth functions independently of its source, perpetuated by people who have never read Plato, sustained by confirmation bias and pattern recognition, amplified by media that prioritize entertainment over accuracy. The myth persists because we want it to. We want to believe in lost wisdom. We want to believe that ancient peoples had knowledge we've forgotten. We want to believe that there are mysteries still to solve, secrets still to uncover. And there are mysteries. There is lost knowledge. Ancient peoples did things we're still working to understand. But those mysteries don't require Atlantis. We have Göbekli Tepe, built 11,000 years ago with massive carved pillars by people we once thought were simple hunter-gatherers. We have the Antikythera mechanism, a Greek analog computer from 2,000 years ago that calculated astronomical positions. We have Roman concrete that has lasted 2 millennia when modern concrete crumbles after decades. We have Mayan mathematical and astronomical sophistication that rivals our own. We have evidence of human complexity, ingenuity, and knowledge stretching back tens of thousands of years. We don't need to invent Atlantis. We have real history. Recent formation, no artifacts, no evidence of construction, no sign of Atlantis. The expedition leader held a press conference. She explained the findings. She showed the evidence. She presented the data. On YouTube, in comment sections, in Facebook groups, in forums dedicated to ancient mysteries, people dismissed the findings. They claimed the researchers were part of a cover-up. They claimed the government was hiding evidence. They claimed that mainstream science refuses to acknowledge the truth. They posted blurry underwater photos claiming to show right angles in the rocks. They posted CGI reconstructions of crystal temples. They posted Edgar Cayce quotes. They posted Donnelly's drawings. They posted anything except the actual evidence. The Atlantis myth will persist. Evidence doesn't kill myths. Myths serve psychological and social functions that facts cannot replace. But for those who care about what actually happened, who care about separating signal from noise, who care about understanding the past rather than projecting fantasies onto it, the evidence is clear. Plato wrote fiction. Donnelly misread it as history. Cayce embellished it with prophecy. Hollywood immortalized it as myth. And we, inheritors of this tangled narrative, face a choice. We can continue believing a story that began with a politician's pseudoscience and a psychic's failed predictions, or we can return to the source, read what Plato actually wrote, understand what he was actually doing, and appreciate Atlantis for what it is, a masterpiece of philosophical fiction that has outlived its author by 2,300 years and counting. The myth doesn't need to be real to be powerful. It just needs to be understood. 3,510 years, nowhere near 12,000, nowhere near 9,600 before Common Era. Shin publishes. The Believers Ignore It, 1982. Ignatius Donnelly's book celebrates its 100th anniversary. It has never gone out of print. New editions add forewords by alternative historians. Amazon reviews praise its visionary research. Academic historians cite it as a classic of pseudo-archaeology. 2007. A team dives off Spain, claiming to have found Atlantis in the mudflats of Doñana National Park. They find nothing. 2011. A team dives off Cuba, claiming to have found Atlantis in underwater formations near the Guanahacabibes Peninsula. They find geological features. 2022. A team announces Atlantis has been located off Crete. They provide no evidence. 2024. A documentary claims new satellite imagery reveals Atlantis in the Sahara. The formations are natural erosion patterns. The pattern repeats. The cycle continues. Someone announces a discovery. Media reports it breathlessly. Scientists investigate. Scientists find mundane explanations. Believers dismiss the scientists. The myth persists. They read Timaeus. They read Critias. They discuss the arguments about cosmology, about politics, about justice. They analyze the literary structure. They compare it to Republic, to Laws, to Plato's other dialogues. They understand what Plato is doing. They write papers about his rhetorical techniques. They examine how he used myth and narrative to convey philosophical concepts. They trace his influence on later thinkers. They appreciate the sophistication of his work, and not one of them believes Atlantis was real. Not because they're closed-minded, not because they're part of a conspiracy, not because they lack imagination, but because they've read the text, understood the context, examined the evidence, and reached the only conclusion the evidence supports. Atlantis is fiction, powerful fiction, influential fiction. Fiction that has shaped Western literature, inspired countless works, and captured imaginations for 23 centuries, but fiction nonetheless. And there's no shame in admitting it. The shame lies in preferring comfortable fantasy to uncomfortable truth, in choosing confirmation bias over critical thinking, in defending belief against evidence. Plato would be horrified. He spent his life arguing that truth matters, that we should question our assumptions, that we should follow logic and evidence wherever they lead. Turning his philosophical thought experiment into a pseudo-historical cult contradicts everything he stood for. If Atlantis existed in the way modern mythology describes, with crystals and flying machines and psychic powers and records hidden under the Sphinx, we would have found it by now. We've mapped the ocean floor, we've excavated thousands of ancient sites, we've analyzed millions of artifacts, we've sequenced ancient DNA, we've read cuneiform tablets, hieroglyphics, Linear B, and countless other ancient scripts. We found Göbekli Tepe, Troy, Tutankhamun's tomb, the Terracotta Army, Machu Picchu, and Angkor Wat. We've discovered cities, civilizations, and peoples that were completely forgotten. But we haven't found Atlantis. And the reason is simple. There's nothing to find. Because Plato made it up. To make a point about politics. In 360 before Common Era, in Athens, on papyrus, in Greek, as fiction? And in making that error, we created a myth more durable than Plato ever imagined. His ideal Athens is forgotten. His Critias is unread outside academic circles. His Republic is assigned in college and promptly forgotten by most students. But Atlantis? Atlantis lives, not as Plato wrote it, as we've rebuilt it, as a mirror of our desires, as a screen for our projections, as a testament not to ancient wisdom but to modern credulity. The story of Atlantis isn't the story of a lost continent. It's the story of how we read, how we believe, and how we choose myth over evidence, even when evidence is freely available. It's the story of Ignatius Donnelly looking at similarities between cultures and seeing proof rather than coincidence. It's the story of Edgar Cayce entering a trance and describing a civilization that matched science fiction tropes of his era. It's the story of divers seeing rectangular rocks and assuming human construction. It's the story of all of us wanting the world to be more mysterious, more ancient, more connected than it is. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the myth serves a purpose. Maybe believing in Atlantis gives people hope that there's more to discover, more to learn, that the past still holds secrets. Maybe it's harmless fun. Except it's not harmless when it's used to deny indigenous achievements, to promote racial theories, to reject scientific methods. It's not fun when it spreads misinformation, when it teaches people to distrust expertise, when it encourages conspiracy thinking. The cost of the Atlantis myth is measured in misdirected research and wasted resources, incredulous minds convinced that mainstream archaeology is lying to them. And for what? For a story Plato invented, for a civilization that never existed, for crystals that never powered anything, for flying machines that never flew, for wisdom that was never lost because it was never real. A narrative technique for making abstract philosophy concrete, a thought experiment about what happens when ideal systems meet real challenges. These are valuable lessons. These ideas have resonated for 2,300 years for good reason. They're true in the ways that matter. Not historically true, philosophically true, morally true, literarily true, but we miss all of that when we're searching the Atlantic for crystal pyramids. We miss the entire point when we're arguing about whether beach rock is artificial. We miss what Plato was trying to teach us when we're convinced he was trying to encode a map, and that's the real tragedy. Not that Atlantis doesn't exist, but that in believing it does, we've lost sight of why Plato wrote about it in the first place. Read the dialogues, examine the evidence, think critically, question your assumptions, follow the data. Trust the scientific method, appreciate myth without requiring it to be history, and maybe, just maybe, we can finally move past the mistake Donnelly made in 1882. Maybe we can finally see Atlantis for what it always was. A story. A brilliant, influential, culturally significant story. But just a story. Nothing more. Nothing less. No crystals. No death rays. No sunken continent. Just Plato. Writing philosophy. Inventing fiction. Creating one of the most successful myths in human history. By accident. Because he was trying to make a point about politics, and we spent 2,000 years missing it.